Hey everyone, as you know, we're going through the book of John right now, and our goal in this sermon series is to take the book and just kind of wring it out for everything, every drop that we can get out of it. First of all, on the question of who wrote the book of John, obviously someone named John wrote it, and if we just take kind of internal evidence from the book, trying to take in what we learned from the book itself, from what the author wants us to know, very clearly that this writer is he calls himself the beloved disciple. He's someone who has lots of access to Jesus, whom Jesus loves dearly, and who is able to be with Jesus at some of his most intimate moments. He's someone who knows the area very well. One thing, and I talked about this in another video, but just we see the precision with which the author is able to give us in terms of locations and where Jesus is at. He doesn't just say Jesus is in Jerusalem or Jesus is hanging out near the temple. He'll say, no, Jesus was hanging out at Solomon's portico or the pool of Siloam. He gives very specific details as to where things are taking place, and it's very clear when you read that the writer is someone who has been with Jesus in these places and is very well acquainted with these locations himself. Now, the most common theory for who the writer of the book of John is just the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, the guy that we see pop up in all the different Gospels as one of the 12 disciples. And there's a lot of attribution to this author in a lot of early church writing as well. So a lot of people in the early church, at least several centuries from this is where the writings that we have afterwards seem to think this is the guy who wrote the book. And there's not any really major reasons to doubt that. There's no, good reasons to say, well, that can't be this person or whatever. But just as another theory, when I came across that I think this is kind of interesting, comes from the letters of a couple of guys named Polycrates and Papias, who are writing, and they're kind of ruminating on some earlier letters or writings of some other people who are closer to the time of writing, and they identify John, who's John the Elder, who lives in Ephesus, as someone who, or the person who wrote the letter. And this person whose tomb was in Ephesus died, and he was also a disciple of Jesus, someone who was very close, but is not the same person as John of Zebedee, son of Zebedee. Now, pretty much everyone agrees that this, because again of the early evidence that we have, some of the early church writings of Eusebius and Irenaeus, who's reflecting on a letter written by Polycarp, or some of the information from Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. We think that he probably composed this in Ephesus. That's kind of a good guess. There's some other kind of crazier theories out there that I'm not going to get into because honestly I don't agree with them or don't believe them. I don't think they're that relevant. But going back to this question of which John is it doesn't actually matter that much. I don't think. I think what matters more is that we just are understanding that this is someone who knew Jesus really well and who knew what they were talking about. And that kind of gets into the sort of the why. Why was the letter written? So again, first of all, the internal evidence. John actually tells us why he's writing the book. He says in John 20 verse 31, it's kind of like the very end of the book. He says, "But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in His name." So that's the goal. That's why why John writes this book, is so that people can read it, they can believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that in believing in Him, that they can find the life that comes from believing in Jesus. It's very cool. And so, piggybacking off of that, kind of going based off of what we know about the author of John as someone who's very close to Jesus, someone who knows Jesus very well, who's very intimately acquainted with Jesus. I think this is a cool way to think about it. So the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes called the synoptics, those Gospels get grouped together a lot of times because of their similarities. And these are Gospels that are very clearly being written after interviewing lots of eyewitnesses, lots of people who had been around in Jesus' ministry, who kind of corroborating their stories, almost like a biographer who's collecting evidence to write like a big, thick biography. I know that you'll sometimes, like for example, I read a great biography on Winston Churchill that was collected off of all these letters that he'd written and interviews with lots of people who were around, and could kind of give some stories about Winston Churchill. And it seems like John is written kind of differently than the Synoptics, as like someone who is just a really good friend of Jesus and is kind of writing later on in life and is saying, so you have these other stories about Jesus and they're all right, but I want to write sort of my supplementary or complementary account of Jesus as well. Kind of the gospel of one of Jesus's best friends. I have this unique and intimate window into Jesus that I just want to share with people that can come alongside the synoptics, the gospels that you've been reading that have been circulating throughout the early church, to kind of add more context, to kind of add more humanity to Jesus almost. And I think it's kind of fun to read that. And so instead of reading like a biography of Winston Churchill, it's collected from all of these sources. I know there's another biography that got written by his son, Randolph Churchill, although his son was not great friends with Winston Churchill apparently. It's like a sort of more intimate biography, and that's what John seems to be written as well. Just this biography of someone who knew Jesus really well and wants to like give you the snapshot of like one of Jesus's best friends. And that's just really cool. I think a really great reason to read John, and to really dig into it. And I think it's why it's written the way it is, and it's actually a little bit different. There's not a ton of crossover in John with the rest of the Gospels. And so that's something to highlight too about John, is just it is different than the other Gospels. It tells a lot of different stories from the Synoptic Gospels. The chronology seems to be a little bit different. Some events that do cross over happen, especially the temple, that happens a lot earlier in John's Gospel than later in the Synoptics. And there's a bunch of reasons why that could be the case. It could be that Jesus does it twice. It could be that John just kind of rearranges the order to tell his story and kind of get his point across in a more kind of in a different way. You see, he had a very specific reason for it. And like I said, it's more precise. That's another thing that differs in John from the Synoptics. It's not vague and kind of explaining where Jesus is at a certain time, which makes more sense for, if you're collecting from from eyewitnesses, long after the fact. But it makes more sense that someone who's actually on the ground the whole time would be able to give a much more specific account, and that's another feature of John. And one other sort of big difference a lot of people comment on is that John is what we might call Christology from above, whereas the Synoptics are what we might call Christology from below. So Christology is a big word that means just the study of Christ, the study of Jesus. And John is studying Jesus. If you start out in the very beginning of the book, you see that he's got this massive view of Jesus and where he comes from. The book starts out where Jesus is the Word who's with God, who comes from God, who kind of breaks into our space from heaven as like the definitive Word from God, because it generates exactly from God, Jesus being God himself. The Synoptics are what we might call Christology from below. They take on a much more sort of boots on the ground, sort of traditional historical perspective at explaining who Jesus was, and sort of gets to the main point of Jesus' full identity finally being revealed towards the end of the book. And so it kind of takes their time to get there. And it's more of like what we might think of as inductive reasoning. More of like we're going to give a bunch of evidence that's eventually going to lead us to sort of the big conclusion that we want to get you to at the very end. Whereas John starts out with like, nope, here's where we're going. This is very deductive. Where I'm going to give you the big picture right off the bat, and you already know it, and so everything you read from here is going to kind of be read in the light of this big thing I'm giving you at the very beginning. And one final thing I just want to touch on is, when was John written? And we don't actually know. With all of these, we're kind of guessing, but most scholars date it somewhere between 70 and 95 AD. Either way, regardless, it's one of the later books that is written in the New Testament. And like I said, that makes sense if the author is kind of saying, hey, I was with Jesus, I knew him intimately, and I've seen all these other Gospels come out, and I just kind of want to add my unique voice to it as well, kind of writing from a different perspective than these other Gospels. Now that you've kind of had them, I want to supplement them with one other one other kind of way to view Jesus, my intimate view of him. And so we don't know. Like I said, we don't know. We're just guessing. But in the book, it says that it talks about, it kind of gives like a little parenthetical at the very end. It's talking about a comment that Jesus makes to Peter about how Peter is going to die. And it seems as if the author of John knows how Peter has died. He actually is, he's been written after Peter has already died. And so if that's true, most scholars think Peter dies somewhere between 60 and 65, just based on the on how we know, or like we're pretty sure that he's martyred by a certain persecution by the Roman Empire, which we know took place during that time. And so if that's true, then John is written sometime after it. And it's probably written at very end of John's life, probably from Ephesus, like we said. So anyway, there's some background on the writer, the author, John, and some of his reasons and why he wrote the book of John. Hope that that's helpful for you. And if you enjoyed this video and you haven't watched any of the other ones we put out, there's actually 4 other videos that you can check out. They're also here on YouTube that dig into some of the topography or the geography of the book of John, diving into some of the people groups that we encounter in the book of John, people like the Pharisees or the chief priests, or just the regular everyday people that Jesus runs into. So if you kind of want to dig deeper, feel free to check those out, and I hope that all of these videos that we're putting out just really help aid you in your study of the book of John and trying to go dig really deep into this amazing book that we have written for us.